All right. Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the developments of slavery in the 19th century. There are previous videos about the earlier slave trade from colonial days, so please feel free to check those out. Those are from my A Push playlist. So in any case, let's actually look through the development of slavery through some maps first before we actually talk about statistics. Actually, this is not directly about slavery. This map, as you can see, is showing us sort of the population density between North and South, and the map really speaks for itself, I think. But just notice already we're seeing that the northern population is growing much more rapidly and is much more densely populated in northern and northwestern areas. Whereas in the south, you do see, of course, sort of the cotton belt, which has a higher population. But in quite a bit of the South, we have a much more rural agrarian population, smaller population, right? One of the things that we start to see over time is that the economic power and the population center in the South is going to start to shift from the upper South, as we call it, so places like Virginia, farther farther towards what we call the lower South or down the river, which is a much more derogatory term. Places like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee, where we're seeing a stronger cotton based economy largely and much more of a slavery stronghold. This map is showing us, and I would actually recommend that you pause this and feel free to zoom in, but this gives us even more detail about not only population density, but also demographics. So, the different racial composition between North and South. We're also seeing the different sources of economic revenue by region, right? So, just to highlight really quickly here, just notice the prevalence of cotton in the deep south, right? Whereas you see a much more diverse economy in the north, one that is arguably much more stable. Because if one industry either fails or there's just a lack of production in a particular year, you have other industries that are going to prevent the economy from completely collapsing. Think about what might happen if the cotton industry is interrupted in the South when it relies so heavily upon it. And for that matter, with the reliance on cotton, we also have the reliance on slave labor, right? So just consider the significance there. Railroad development is also crucial. We'll talk about this more once we actually get into the Civil War. But just notice that with the growth of the transportation network and the interstate trade network, we're going to see that the Northwest is going to develop much more quickly and be much more economically successful. A city like Chicago just springs up from overnight practically. It was virtually non existent in the 1830s. And with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was shortly after the end of the Civil War, we just see places like this boom almost overnight, right? Whereas in the South, you do see railroad networks, but not as many. They're not as extensive. And one thing that this map does not indicate to us, but that was true, is that some of these railway networks, particularly in the South, they were not standardized with some of the other rail networks. So the easiest way to describe that is with the gauge of the railroad track, right? You think about gauge, the width of the track, right? And if the gauge were standard, that would mean that any train, regardless of size, regardless of origin, would be able to access that train line, right? If you have the same gauge train track, then the train can just pass through. In many southern railway networks, the gauges were a different size. And so the trains would actually, if you were coming from, let's say, New York, and you wanted to go into South Carolina, you might have to stop off at a place like Richmond, unload, and then get on a different train, which had a different size gauge, right? So this also really hindered transportation. And this is going to be much more of a problem for the South in the Civil War when they need a lot of supplies and they need them quickly. Right. Just to really conclude with what some of these graphs were showing us in these past few slides, right, we see that the northern population is much higher than the southern population. On the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the two-thirds of the entire American population, or North American population, or more specifically, the U.S. population was located in the north and northwest of the country, right? Whereas one third of the entire population was in the south, and one half of that one third, right? So one sixth of the entire U.S. population, which was totally in the south in this instance, was made up of slaves, right? So that's really significant as well. So that sounded complicated. What I mean is half of the southern population that we're looking at was made up of slaves, right? We talked again, just to go back to this slide, about the economic diversity of the North versus the South, right? You have more manufacturing industries with the growth of the Industrial Revolution. You're going to see that, in particular, very much benefits the northern economy in terms of diversification and just profitability, diversity, a greater supply of labor because the population was so much bigger. Most immigrants who entered the United States came in to northern areas because that's where there were more jobs, especially in urban areas. So, in general, this was really significant in terms of helping develop the northern and northwestern economy. There were so many people there that were able to work and for a low price. The transportation network, also, we talked about that quite a bit, so hopefully that speaks for itself. Um, we talked about this already. So again, the southern population much, much smaller, about 1/3 of the entire U.S. population, and one half of that was made up of slaves. You again see a predominantly rural economy, largely dominated by cotton, just cotton, right? So we tend to refer to this phrase "king cotton" or "cotton is king" to allude to the idea of the strength and almost a dominance of the cotton industry on the southern economy and the U.S. economy as a whole, for that matter, because the northern economy depended on that raw cotton for their textile manufacturing, right? They needed that cotton to make clothes and to make money, right? So, despite the growth of the abolition movement in northern areas, the North still relied on slave labor, at least economically. Right? And to really exhibit this cotton is king idea, just notice that again, the year before the Civil War starts in 1860, the South was, or the U.S. as a whole, was exporting 5 million bales of cotton a year, and that accounted for over half, well over half, of the total American exports. And so this is again really going to be I know I keep nodding ahead to the Civil War here, but when we get to the Civil War, think about how important that economic source of revenue is, and suddenly, if the country is divided in half virtually, what that's going to do to the economy, right? And we already talked about the lack of transportation network in the South. Okay, again, just I know I'm really image heavy on these slides because in a lot of ways I think they speak for themselves. So just notice the predominance of the cotton industry in the South, in particular the deep South, or again the down the river South, as we say, right? We could consider that to be the Mississippi River Delta in particular, right? Because it was such a long and extensive trade network and a very, very busy port, which could export things like raw cotton very easily to places like the Caribbean and, of course, to Europe and West Africa as a whole, right? And then notice again that there still is there's a significant cotton industry, even though it looks small, right? But this economy nonetheless is not particularly diverse, and that will be problematic. Just looking at these two images, right? This is a map showing the areas of cotton production in 1820, right? So shortly after the War of 1812 is over. This is in the middle of the era of good feelings, which we already talked about. And let's zoom forward to 1860, right before the Civil War, right? Notice how much the cotton industry has expanded just in this 40-year period. If you want images to explain to us some of the causes, some of the economic and social causes, and even political, of course, of the Civil War, just notice this, right? As the South becomes increasingly reliant on the cotton industry, in particular, once the U.S. expands westward, note Texas here, right? Think about how the Civil War is arguably inevitable. All right, just one more image to show us the cotton is king idea, right? And again, we talked about this earlier, but it's not just important to know that more than half of the U.S. exports were made up of cotton by 1860. Notice how rapidly these exports grow, right? That at the turn of the 19th century, this was a very small part of the U.S. export market, right? And so, arguably, because the slavery question remained unanswered after the ratification of the Constitution, this only allows for cotton and, more importantly, the slave trade, just the peculiar institution of slavery as a whole. No wonder it expands when remained unchecked. And even though at this point, by 1808, so right in between these two pie charts, The international slave trade, at least into the Americas, was technically abolished, right? You could no longer import slaves from abroad after 1808, but slavery itself was not abolished. So this is more of an impetus for American slave owners to make the most money out of the slaves that they already own. What this translates into is the increase of the slave population naturally. More slaves are reproducing and having children because it is no longer legal, at least, to import slaves from places like West Africa. That does not, by the way, mean that the slave trade stopped. It just became illegal, right? So slaves were illegally smuggled into the United States after that, which was much more complicated, much more dangerous, and we'll talk about the ramifications of one of those incidents with the Amistad case in a little bit. All right, I want to cut off here and pick up with a part two, but we're going to start talking about the conditions of slavery and early emancipation movements next. All right, so stay tuned and thanks.